I keep looking up there and thinking, no, it's not time to start yet, so.
9:06 is what I have.
Right, okay, we're gonna start with a pop quiz.
All right, let's go.
Our topic is sacrifice in the ancient world. And what I'd like to say, sacrifice in the ancient world is one thing we're gonna talk about. Now, what I'd like to ask you is, when you use the word sacrifice today, what do you mean? What would be a situation in which you would use the word sacrifice?
Giving up something.
Okay, giving up something? Anything beyond that? Just giving up anything, anytime, or giving up anything? When is giving up something a sacrifice?
Something that you want to do, or something that you want to have for the benefit of others. You don't take it or do it.
Can I come in?
So you, yeah,
But,
Trying to play a significant role on behalf of an organization or group of people, or it could be a family, to bring certain things into establishment or have certain things fulfilled on behalf of them, what they could not do by themselves.
so in that we have a phrase, for example, we're talking about military, people who die in battle, we say they have made the supreme sacrifice. But we don't usually, that's the most extreme use of the word, right? We use it pretty much every day. You might even hear it at church if we had a real financial problem and somebody got up and said, we're going to have to give sacrificially. So what's the difference in giving and giving sacrificially?
Hurts a little.
It's
Yeah,
something that,
amped up.
yeah, something that you really didn't want to give up or couldn't afford to give up. It was going to hurt you in some way. It's somehow to your detriment.
One
Yeah.
time in Abidjan, during the coup, a group of family members of mine had just arrived at the airport and a hell of a shooting was going on. So I have to take the car and drive through in the shooting, gunfire from behind, because we're living behind the military barracks. I got to pass through the fire maneuver and come all the way to the airport, pick them out, passes through the fire again, they were free. I said, we just got to do this. And we go back to Cocody. That was a sacrifice.
Yeah, someone is putting their own life in danger or even giving it in order to help. We could sacrifice. Well, anyway, so it's a very common modern word. What we sort of don't have in our vocabulary anymore is sacrifice in a religious sense. Now, maybe we talk at the end if we have time about there are some forms of Christianity that still maintain the idea of sacrifice. For example, I mentioned this several times before, but the traditional Mass is called the sacrifice of the Mass, and there is still a tendency to identify that as an act of religious sacrifice. In the Protestant world, most of the Christian world outside of that, the word sacrifice is only used in a symbolic way. We'll come back to that too. What I'd like to do this morning is first talk about sacrifice as the pagans understood sacrifice, and then as the Jews did, and then as the Christians did, how you see it in the New Testament. So let's just say that in general, sacrifice is to give up something. In a religious sacrifice, is to give up something that you have to please a deity in some way, right? That's sacrifice in the ancient sense. You give something, it's not like saving one of your relatives, giving up your life for them. It's like giving something to a deity because they want it. And you will somehow please them by giving it to them. This is sort of the idea behind sacrifice. And it's as I say, it's an ancient idea, not so much a modern one, but it was very, very common in the ancient world, the idea of sacrifice. And let's look just for a moment first at pagan sacrifices. People's lives were full of these sacrifices. Some of them were public in the temples that had to do maybe with the whole nation or something, or with honoring some god or goddess. But they were done either to show respect to the deity or to show gratitude. You would, if you had won a battle or you would have a prosperous year, you would sacrifice something, or to seek the favor of the deity. So I hope we have a good harvest next year, or that we win this battle, and going to the deity to ask for that, or for protection. There's an enemy coming, please protect us, or to celebrate a victory or something like that. So there are all sorts of reasons that you did it, but it was basically sort of the same thing. You gave up something to honor the deity, or often, and this is very common in the ancient world, you did it to appease the deity, because the deity is obviously angry. For example, if you have a famine, or you have a flood, I can guarantee you that a few thousand years ago, if the Pacific Palisades had all burned down, the next day the populace would be offering sacrifices to the gods or to some god, saying, please don't do this to us. Why are you angry with us? There was a sense in a lot of religions, particularly as you got further to the east in the ancient world, that the gods are pretty much angry pretty much all the time. And they had good reason to think that if they felt the gods were causing all the bad things to happen, because lots of bad things happen to them. Or maybe it's not a god, maybe it's just a spirit. Maybe there's a certain bridge that you go over that you don't want it to fall in while you go across, but you're pretty sure that the spirit that guards that bridge is angry with you. So you might make a sacrifice before you go across the bridge, just to be sure that they are. That, by the way, is the background of the old fairy tale Billy Goat Gruff, who's guarding the bridge. You know, this is a spiritual being. Another thing that was done in the ancient world, in the pagan world, not in the Jewish world, was divination. You killed an animal, offered it as a sacrifice, but then you also split the animal open and you investigated its insides. Might be a chicken, or all the way up to a bull. You would check the insides, and you could tell what the gods were thinking. I don't know how you could tell, but they had this whole idea that they could tell, or they could tell what was going to happen. This was divination. You don't have so much. You do have stories of divination in the Old Testament, but not in the official worship of God, in the official sacrifices. Now, the various types of sacrifices you had. Usually we think of it sacrificing an animal, and the sacrifice consists of not only giving the animal's body, but the death of the animal is part of the sacrifice. And the animal might be a sheep, it might be cattle, it might be pigs. It's often pigs in the pagan world. Sometimes this would be followed by a sort of sharing in the sacrifice with the god by having a big barbecue. I mean, it sounds sort of odd, but even in the Old Testament, you have that. You sacrifice the animal, and then you take parts of the animal, and the priests have a feast, or the population have a feast. They eat this, and they think of that kind of a feast as being sort of participating with the deity. The deity is present in you're eating with them, as well as in honor of them. But there are other things besides animals. They call it a drink offering, where you would have wine or nectar of some kind, and you would pour it on the altar instead of having an altar burning and to burn the flesh on there. There were sometimes people would give precious objects as a sacrifice. They would bring their gold jewelry or whatever and put it on the altar and let it melt and burn as an offering. First fruits, it was very common, and of course you get this in Judaism too. The first fruits of the harvest you bring and you give them to the deity. You don't keep them. you sacrifice them to the deity. I just have to tell you, I'll make it short, but when I was living one summer in a kibbutz in northern Israel, we happened to be there during the Feast of the First Fruits. And so, of course, we were working in archaeology nearby, and we were asked to participate. They had a parade, and you brought all the first fruits by in the parade, and everybody applauded. I never did see them give any of this stuff away. This is the modern world. Where in the ancient world, they would have destroyed all of it. What we did was we brought little boxes full of shards, pieces of ancient pottery, and walked in the parade. But what was interesting to me is they grew a lot of things there. They grew artichokes and figs and various things, but they had a big plant there where they made toilet paper. And so one of the floats in the first fruit parade was a big truck bed with a huge roll of toilet paper. It was about 10 feet high. And that was the first fruits of the factory. So that's my experience with sacrifice of the first fruits. But anyway, here are a couple of the prayers that you might have heard in a pagan ceremony. I call upon you, Jupiter, and you, Mars, to hear my prayer. May you grant victory to our legions and protect the Roman people. If you grant us victory, I vow to sacrifice a pig or a sheep or a bull to you in gratitude. So there you can see the thinking. It's a kind of a transaction in a way. You do this for me, I do this for you. Here's another, this is a prayer to Janus. We have January as our first month. Janus was the god of new beginnings. Interesting prayer. Hail, Father Janus, Lord of beginnings. On these calends of January, O God of commencements, I bring you offerings of wine, bread, cheese, and honey, which I give to you with good prayers and good heart, wishing to honor you on this day of yours, this new year, and that you look kindly on this home and those who dwell in it, granting us your blessing and protection throughout the 12 months that start today. That's very interesting. We could adjust that a little and make it into a prayer we might pray on New Year's Day today. So this is the pagan context. I want to show you now 3 pictures, unless we've already got them up. Okay, the first one is interesting because here you have a ceremony getting ready to sacrifice, and you have you have 3 types of sacrifice here. You have the bull, you have the sheep, and you have the pig. And they're marching in the ceremony toward the altar. The people there are considerably happier than the animals, even though I guess the animals don't know what's about to happen to them. But they're being taken to the altar where they will be slaughtered, and then the divination will be done, and so on. So this is a contemporary picture of the procession. The second picture is this is actually an altar where the sacrificial either flesh or fruit or whatever would be put on top. But the picture on the altar is of a bull being in the act of being sacrificed. And what's interesting to me is the priest in this case is a priestess. It's a woman. I don't know if you can see that. The one behind the altar in the carving is a woman, and it seems to be maybe a woman to one side of her. But the person who seems to be slaughtering the animal is a male. And it's very interesting. In the ancient world, there were very important priestesses who were women. Often these big ceremonies would be held in the priestess. We've probably heard stories of the Vestal Virgins and the various priestesses that had great power. Interestingly, they usually were not the one who actually slaughtered the animal. The priestess would have a male assistant who would get the blood on themselves. The priestess did not do that. I think it's interesting. I haven't ever read exactly why they did it that way. But if it was not a blood sacrifice, often the priestess would do it by themselves. And the way you know that someone is the priest or the priestess is they take part of their robe and put it over their head. This is in some religions, for example, in Islam, putting a thing over your head is what you do to show reverence to God. Well, I think the same idea here, but it was also to show that you were representing the people to the god. And so you put that on. So in ancient drawings or carvings, if you see a woman with a veil over her head like that, that means that she is acting as a priestess. And let's look at that third picture now. I don't know about women in the picture, but if you see the man who's actually reaching down, there's a bull back there looking a little concerned. He knows something is up. The priest is getting the altar ready, and you know he's the priest because he's got the veil over his head. One particular reason I wanted to show you this, it's not exactly apropos to the topic, but you see the boy standing there facing the priest, and he's playing kind of a trumpet thing or a flute. 9 pictures out of 10 almost of ancient sacrifices, there's a person standing there playing a flute. And I've often wondered whether one of the early Christians, of course, did not have any instrument in their worship. And it's a little bit odd when you think about that, because instruments always accompanied worship in the ancient world. They accompanied worship both in Judaism and in Christianity. And I mean, in Judaism and in paganism. For some reason, they did not in Christianity. And you wonder, well, why is this? And some people have suggested that one of the reasons for it is that built into the idea of worship, of sacrifice in the ancient world was playing an instrument. And I just thought this is an interesting, because here's a contemporary carving where you see the instrument is there and the person is playing. And part of the Christians' sort of testimony that they were not a part of the pagan world is they got rid of the flute. See what I mean? It was a kind of a symbolic thing. I don't know that that's the reason, but it's just an interesting thing. Okay, now there are a whole series of passages in the Apostle Paul's writings, particularly in 2 Corinthians or 1 Corinthians, where he talks about meat offered to idols. And you need to see these passages in the context of what I've been talking about here. The animal would be slaughtered, its innards would be investigated, then they would take certain portions of it, the priests would take, and then certain portions of it would be available to the people. Now, what you did to get this is you would go to the temple and you would buy it. It's like a meat market. There was always a meat market. Or not always, but in some temples, there was the meat market at the temple. And this was not ordinary meat. This was grade A, US, whatever. I mean, this was the finest meat you could get. It had been offered to a god, and the god had infused it. And if you ate this meat, you were receiving not only meat and sustenance, you were receiving the spirit of this god. And that's where this comes from. So if you go to a banquet that's sponsored by a pagan and they serve meat, the Christian has this problem. What if this meat was bought over at the temple of Jupiter as a part of a pagan sacrificial ceremony? Should I eat it? And we won't go through these passages, but you might want, just for your own curiosity, to go back and read Paul's discussions of whether you ought to eat meat that's been offered to idols. It's very interesting to see how what Paul's advice is about that. Now I want to turn briefly to Old Testament sacrifices. The Old Testament system was, I talked about this before, was based really on 2 things: on making sacrifices, particularly blood sacrifices, and on keeping lots of laws about purity, food laws and things you did that made you impure. You don't want to be impure, and you want to do all the sacrifices. Now, of course, in 70 AD, by the way, the other rule was you can't make blood sacrifices anywhere but the temple in Jerusalem. That's where you do it. It's the only place you're allowed to do it in Judaism. Well, now the temple is totally destroyed. And Josephus, with great drama, says on such and such hour, on such and such day, the last sacrifice was made in the temple. And there's never been one made since that was 2,000 years ago. A day or so later, the temple was destroyed. And so it's not been possible for Jews to make blood sacrifices since, which means that Judaism totally changed. It had been based on these blood sacrifices, and now you can't have them anymore. So of course it turned to prayer and the study of the Torah, and that's what modern Judaism is. It's very different from Judaism, say, that Jesus experienced, or the Old Testament form. But Old Testament sacrifices, actually, I was talking to somebody this week who's a theologian, and I said, do you know of any real difference in why the Jews made blood sacrifices and why the pagans did? And he said, no, really, they did it for exactly the same reason. Here's my list. For gratitude, to fulfill obligations. Now, maybe one possible difference was that Jewish sacrifice, a lot of it was to atone for sin. And pagans didn't have pagans didn't have much of a concept of sin. That may be hard for us as Christians to understand people. Well, I don't know. I guess we've all probably known people. There's a sort of secular idea that sin is not a thing. They really would not. In fact, they might find it kind of humorous to say that somebody felt a bad conscience because of their sins. Would sound kind of old-fashioned. Sounds kind of Christian, you know. But the Jews did have a very strong sense of sin, and the sacrifices were made to cancel out to atone for those sins. That might be a difference, but otherwise there are dozens of sacrifices mentioned in the Old Testament that are exactly the same kind the pagans would do. It's just that the Jew is sacrificing to God, to Yahweh, and not to Jupiter or Mars or somebody. They had burnt offerings. They had what they called sin offerings. They had trespass offerings. There are a whole list. You can go to Leviticus and see all these different kinds of offerings for different purposes. Now, in Jesus' time, in the earliest days of Christianity, that was still going on. In the later books of the New Testament that are written after 70, the temple is gone. And sometimes that's one of the clues you can use to see when a New Testament book was written. How does it treat the temple and the sacrifice? Now I want to turn to the New Testament. The word sacrifice appears 54 times in the New Testament, or in the English translations of the New Testament. This week, just my own curiosity, I went over every one of the 54, and it is very interesting to see what they do. Often they are referring to the Old Testament sacrifices. Jesus, I don't know if this is, I think I'm right. The only time Jesus ever uses the word sacrifice is when he says, remember what Isaiah said, that God desires mercy and not sacrifice. It's very interesting that Jesus' only teaching in regard to what to do about sacrifice is to substitute mercy for sacrifice. God desires mercy and not sacrifice. But there's another stream in the New Testament that we consider very important today in our religious language. And that is that Jesus is our sacrifice. Jesus either sacrifices himself, or he is the sacrifice. And so we have developed a whole range of vocabulary, such as Jesus, the Lamb of God. We'll look at some of the passages in just a minute, but it's interesting to see that theme in which the sacrificial language of the Old Testament has been taken and applied to Jesus and applied to the cross and applied to the death of Jesus, so that the earliest Christians began to describe Jesus as the Lamb of God and Jesus' death as the sacrifice. Now, the theologians have worked for 2,000 years since then to try to work that out. What exactly does that mean? And there are elaborate theories by, you know, Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and all of the great theologians have written hundreds of pages on what does that mean? If Jesus is our atonement, or when it says we are saved by the blood of Christ, how is that tied to the ancient ideas of sacrifice? And in what way does that work within Christianity? Let's look at a few passages. Of course, we can't do any of these, anything like justice, but just to get the wording right now, I just am reminding us of the wording. In Romans 3 and verse 25, God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. I mean, every word in there, you could stop and look at it. You have God as the priest. You have Christ as the sacrifice. You have the sacrifice is for atonement, and it's done by the shedding of blood. See, all of this would be a picture in an ancient person's mind of a ceremony they had seen 100 or 1,000 times. It's hard for us to sit in their seat and try to figure out what does Paul's language mean to them? You know, how are they seeing this? How are they understanding this? And then Paul sort of sums all of this up by picturing a very realistic picture of an ancient blood sacrifice in which the victim is killed and the blood comes out and you catch it in a bowl and you do all of these things with it. It's the sacrifice of atonement. You pour the blood on the altar, you pour it in the Holy of Holies, you do all of these things. And this picture comes in everybody's mind. And then it says, to be received by faith. So so what you are doing is you're making this sacrifice. I mean, it's creating because of your faith. That's what's making it the sacrifice. And well, again, I got to keep moving here, but so much we could say about that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 20, Paul says, through him, Jesus, through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Now the picture there, I think, would be the ancient person would think that's a sacrifice of reconciliation. That's like if I had a really bad argument with my friend and we went to the temple and we offered a sacrifice together and the priest slit the throat of the lamb and the blood spurted out onto and that would be the blood shed for reconciliation. So now you see Jesus is being pictured symbolically as a different kind of sacrifice. Here, the sacrifice not of atonement for our sins, but of reconciliation. But this is reconciliation of all things. This pulls all things together, whether things on earth or things in heaven, and makes peace. Now let's turn to somebody besides Paul, 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. For you know that it was not with perishable things, such as silver or gold, that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. So much, again, is in that passage, and certainly would have been to a first century person who had seen sacrifice after sacrifice, whether they were Jewish or whether they were pagan, they had done it. So he says, look, it's not something you bought. By the way, that's how you did your sacrifice. You went to the temple and that's why they had to have money changers. It was like a big stockyards, and you bought a lamb or you bought a dove or something. And says it's not, you didn't buy this with silver and gold. But you were redeemed from the empty way of life that you were given by your ancestors with the precious blood of Christ without blemish. And of course, this is Old Testament language because the lamb that you sacrificed couldn't just be any old lamb. It had to be a lamb without blemish. It had to be perfect in every way. It had to be what we'd say today, a prize winning. At the local fair, it would have won the prize as the best lamb in its class. Those are the ones you have to sacrifice. And so the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. So it's not just Paul who uses this kind of language. You have Peter using it too. And actually there are numerous places, or a number of places in the book of Revelation with John, another of the key people in the New Testament, that talk about the blood of the lamb, sometimes in very vivid ways, like being washed in the blood. We even have that old hymn, how does that go?
Power in the blood.
There's power, it says, and you've been washed in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb, coming from these passages. And today we try to not take any of those literally because they sound so gory. To the ancient people, they were not thinking of it that way, but they did. It became very common to think of Jesus as being like an unblemished lamb. And you get this whole vision in the first part of Revelation where the whole host of heaven is together and they're waiting with great anticipation. And what shows up? A lamb that was slain. And so we've developed a huge Christian vocabulary based on these ancient concepts of sacrifice and blood sacrifice. Now we come to Hebrews. And there's an extensive passage, which I'm just going to read. I'm not going to comment too much on it. First, you have in Hebrews, it's in Hebrews 9. And in the 12th verse, it says, he, Jesus, did not enter the sanctuary. Now Jesus is being pictured as the high priest. He's going into the Holy of Holies. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. These are all figures of speech, you can see. But now Jesus is pictured not so much as the lamb, but as the high priest. But the blood he has in the bowl he's taking in, he didn't get by slitting the throat of a lamb. It's his own blood. He is sacrificing his own blood, like the priest would have sacrificed the blood of the lamb or the calf or whatever it was. Now listen to this passage beginning in verse 18 of Hebrews chapter 9. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the peoples, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, the book, the Torah, and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant that God commanded to you. And in the same way, he sprinkled with blood both the tent and all the vessels used in the worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything was purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Thus, it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified by these rites, but the heavenly things themselves are better sacrifices than these. You see where this very sophisticated writer of Hebrews is going. He said, what these people were doing was a kind of a symbol for the reality, which is not blood and tents and things. It's something much more spiritual than that. But we had to have this to sort of understand what was going on. For Christ has entered, not into holy places made with hands, which are the copies of true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy place every year with blood not his own, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Now, this would be wonderful to look at word by word, but I hope we've said enough about sacrifice and the content of sacrifice that you can see what Hebrews is doing. It's saying, let's understand these sacrifices this way. Let's understand them as images. You remember Plato? A lot of people point out that the writer of Hebrews had read a lot of Plato. He uses that. What we see is the shadow. What we see are the symbols. But the reality is there. So sacrifices are symbols. They're not the reality as ancient people thought they were. Now, the final point I will make today is I've looked for years and years once I began to realize this, and the New Testament always spiritualizes all this, what I think the word is sacerdotal language, all this language of priests and altars and sacrifices. It never uses when it uses it literally, it uses it to mean what the pagans and the Jews do. When it uses it of the Christian life, it always uses it spiritually. Unfortunately, the Christian church as a comprehensive 2,000-year-old phenomenon in history has often misunderstood and keeps trying to go back to literal sacrifice, to literal priests, to literal sanctuaries, to literal altars. There's just something in us. We just kind of want to do that, you know. And we keep going back. To me, the key couple of verses in the whole New Testament, I've always keep these verses in my head in case I'm somewhere in a little country church and they say, we got Brother Wilson today, well, let's just have him preach for us. I've actually had that happen. I said, first I tell them I'm not a preacher, and they say, yeah, but you get up and talk. And so I have to have a sermon in my head, you know, and it's this one.
Wow.
You're gonna get the whole thing, so sit still. We don't have time to go to church today.
That's okay, John, you're only 10:15.
Okay. Very good. Anyway, here's Romans chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. And the word worship, which is translated different ways in different translations, the Greek word means what a priest does at the altar. We get the word liturgy from that. Latreia is the Greek word. And that's what the priests did at the altar. See how Paul is using all this language, but he's completely spiritualizing it. So what is the sacrifice? It is your body. And who are the priests? You're the one doing the liturgy. Do not, now here's what it is. Okay, he says, do it. Now what is it? Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. To me, there's no other two verses in the Bible that sum up Christianity any better than that. And they use the sacerdotal language, but they use it in a Christian way, which is totally different from the way either the Jews or the pagans use the language of sacrifice. And the interesting thing to me is we tend to apply the language of sacrifice almost entirely to our worship. Like when you go to church, when Paul completely detached, there's not a word in here about going to church. I didn't tell you to not go to church. I just tell you that Paul says the sacrifice doesn't take place at church. It takes place in life. Life becomes the liturgy. You become the priest. Your body becomes the sacrifice. And it spiritualizes and, dare I say it, moralizes. It eventually says it's your behavior and not what somebody who's called a priest does that brings about atonement. And it's not just your behavior, but behind your behavior, it's your faith. I go back to that other verse I read. These things are appropriated. The blood of Christ is appropriated through our faith. And then it in a sense is, we become the sacrifice then. The spotless sacrifice, by the way. After all, it was our sins that were atoned. And now we, as the pure and unblemished sacrifice, offer that purity to God in the way we operate in the world. And then one other verse to show you it's not just Paul, 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5. So much in this verse that makes the same point. You also, he says, speaking to Christians, like living stones are being built into a spiritual house, there's the temple, to be a holy priesthood, they're the priests, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Okay, I'll admit the second most important verse in the Bible, forgetting all of Christianity, even into one verse, Paul took two. Peter just takes one. Let me read it one more time and then we'll quit. How did I do? I think I made it, didn't I? Yes. You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Now, if you still feel the need to go to church, well, go ahead. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Zoom people, I'm just kidding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Oh, Fallon's not here.
No. I don't know if I have a question.
Okay.
But as you were talking, and I can't help but hear these are the two most important verses in the Bible, and I love that, by the way, but it's kind of altered because then, Jesus saying all the law and the prophets hinges on love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, spirit. I just messed that up, and then love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
Do you think, so to me, that sounds foundational that then this priesthood would be built on. Do you think that was in the minds of the writers as they're doing this? Is that what they're coming from? Are they separate? Is it not appropriate to cross them?
No, I think, of course, that is in a sense saying the same thing in a slightly different way. I think what you get here is when you read the teaching of Jesus, which is what's guiding what Peter and Paul say, obviously, Jesus is speaking before he dies. And the early Christians had to they had to come to understand the death of Jesus. And a lot of what we call Christian theology is to say, why did the Son of God, who taught things that would change the world and would usher in the new age, why was somebody allowed to kill him? And the Christians had to really, the very earliest Christians had to really struggle with that. But it didn't take them long. I mean, within the lifetime of a man like Peter, he was beginning to understand it. In this sense, he was beginning to understand that what is happening is something is being acted out in our world that is going on in heaven. That's what you get in Hebrews. Or they begin to say, what is happening here is the reality of what was happening in a symbolic way over in the temple. So they begin to use this words like the blood of Christ. And that becomes the way Christians ever since have explained what would otherwise be unexplainable. By the way, something I forgot to mention. When Jesus is giving them the Lord's Supper, he does use the word blood. He takes the fruit of the vine and he says, "This is my blood of the covenant." Well, that immediately goes back, we read that phrase already. We read it in Hebrews, the blood of the covenant. The blood of the covenant was the blood that the priest sprinkled in the Holy of Holies. So Jesus is already making that tie. But I think Jesus says all of these things, but he does say several times, I have to die. But he doesn't really ever very much explain that. He'll just say something like, well, prophets always have to die or something. But we owe to his apostles this theological pulling this together to say, yes, Jesus had to die because blood has to be spilled. The lamb has to go to the slaughter, and Jesus becomes our lamb. So you can see how it develops. So the sort of the whole development of the way we understand the sacrifice of Jesus comes back. That's why it's important for us to kind of get our first century glasses on a little bit when we read these and think, see how this struck these people and answered the big question they had.
My question is, why the font is so difficult? It was already predestined from the book of Genesis. If you could go back to the first book, which was the first book in the Torah, and then again, if you look at the whole tabernacle, that was a complete roadmap to his crucifixion. The whole tabernacle symbolized Jesus Christ, the
Yeah.
David. He represented, he was there, the priest, and also the sacrificial lamb. Everything is there.
Yeah.
Why the font is so difficult?
Well, of course, the thing is,
Even a
it's always
blind man-
much simpler to do
Blind man could remember
hindsight.
the story.
We tend to be a lot more insightful in these kinds of things because we have the benefit, of having seen, known about Christ and known about the death of Christ and known about the development of the Christian understanding of those things. So I'm sort of that way about Old Testament prophets. People say, well, why couldn't people see that? Well, it's very hard to see the meaning of prophecy until it's been fulfilled. And they say, oh, yeah, but it comes afterward. And so the tabernacle, for example, now the writer of the book of Hebrews has the advantage of having known of the crucifixion of Christ. But Hebrews was not written before that happened. It was written afterwards. So he can see how all of these things become figures. Yes.
I'm gonna just, going back to the literal sacrifice issue, I was just thinking, one of the differences between, to me, the Jewish and pagan was getting rid of human sacrifice with Abraham and Isaac, for instance.
Yeah.
And in fact, a lot of some of the Old Testament would condemn sacrificing children.
Right.
And yet, at the end, with the Christian faith, we have a God in human form being the sacrifice. So we're kind of going back to that.
Yeah.
That I just kind of.
Yeah, and in fact, I had contemplated trying to spend a little time on it because there was human sacrifice in some forms of paganism. The Romans, by the way, did not allow it. They in most generally, and most of the Greeks didn't either. They thought that was something that barbarians would do. But human sacrifice was, for example, the Native American cultures. The most advanced ones were the ones that performed it the most. And on a grand scale, they would sacrifice 1,000 people in one day, and you do those kinds of things. And that was a kind of a substitutionary atonement thing. I give this person's life for mine. And the ancient Phoenicians did it. Archaeologists have found these big jars that are full of the skeletons of babies. They were very commonly gave babies as sacrifices. And you do have what sounds like it's going to be an approval of human sacrifice in the Old Testament, a very famous story. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Abraham and his son. God orders him to sacrifice his son as the altar and the whole thing. So, we could talk about that, but it's there is that little stream. So the word sacrifice is a broad word that just means to give up something of value, and it doesn't exclude human sacrifice. Now, it was not in the law of Moses to sacrifice humans. I'm not sure whether there's anything in the Torah.
But if God said thou shalt not murder, then that there's no need for human sacrifice.
Yeah, well, yeah, it may be covered by the thou shalt not kill.
Thou shalt
I
not
don't
kill,
know.
there was no need for human
Although they
sacrifice.
did kill in battle. It's a very complicated question, but it is interesting, that is, and pagans often criticized Christianity, saying it's based on human sacrifice. But understand again that Christians never meant any of these words to be taken literally. They never meant that Jesus was literally a sacrifice. It's that Jesus played the part in the history of human redemption that sacrifice had sought to play all the years, and that's sort of the point of Hebrews, the book of Hebrews. So, but it is an interesting issue, so, and the Christians did get criticized for it. Yeah, Steve.
I think this concept of covenant, a contract between humans and God, how is that
Yeah,
appreciated? And Christ was chosen before the world was created. That's what Peter says,
yeah.
for this,
Uh-huh.
to assure this contract.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the glue that I've seen that holds it all together. And what's interesting is it helps you understand this primitive sacrifice in the Old Testament. That's kind of primitive. Even in the temple, that's kind of primitive.
Yeah.
But you realize it once you say, ah,
Yeah. In fact, there's another whole thing that we could talk about is that this whole blood covenant is not quite the same as blood sacrifice. Even though a blood covenant may be done in a context of a sacrifice. But, you know, even little boys on my block, I grew up in a very rough neighborhood, but we had a blood covenant where you cut yourself and the other person cuts themselves, and then you touch the blood together. That's a blood covenant, and that cannot be broken. And so when Jesus says, "This is my blood of the covenant," he may be referring to that kind of blood covenant, which is very common in the ancient world. And I know that Native Americans did it because I've seen it in lots of movies. But it's a little bit different because it implies a sort of a deal, an agreement between two parties. And so there is that element in sacrifice. But of course, the covenant that we make with God is a covenant between two beings that are very unequal. I used to know the technical name for that, but the covenant that God made with Israel, for example, it's not a 50% covenant. You know, it's a 99%, 1% covenant. The powerful individual in it is making it just out of the goodness of their heart. They don't have to do it. So when they say, when God says to Israel, if you will keep the 10 Commandments and keep the purity laws and so on like that, then I will bless you. He doesn't have to. That's a covenant that he makes out of his goodness.
He was the God of the covenant.
Right, right.
That was distinguishing from every other creature, because he was the God of the covenant.
That's right. And you had one of the problems that the ancient pagans had was they constantly had to keep making deal after deal after deal with their deities.
Their deity can betray them, but he doesn't betray Israel.
Right. And you will notice all the way through this idea of the covenant, from Abraham on, the Jews are confident that they have a covenant with God that he will keep. The pagans did not have that kind of assurance. But I guess the point is, and I frankly don't know, and I've asked some people who are much better theologians than I, what exactly does Jesus mean when he says, "This is my blood of the covenant"? Is the blood there the blood of, is he referring to the blood of the ancients, of the sacrifice where we say, Jesus died for my sins? Or is he referring to the covenant that we have made with him? That what you need to be thinking about when you drink the fruit of the vine is, I have a covenant with Christ. I do my part by faith. He did his part by blood. And then we think about the implications of that. And that's what he means when he says, "Here, drink this. This is my blood of the covenant." So it's not so much you need, I've often thought, don't get me started on communion, but I've often thought it's not a case of trying to recreate Christ on the cross. I mean, that's certainly involved, but it's not just the blood of the cross, it's the blood of the covenant. And a covenant means an agreement between two people. So what the meditation that needs to be going on is our remembering our part of the covenant. This is his part. What is my part? That's why I think Paul says, let each person